And I think, but we're really early on the journey, right?
Yeah,
We have to remember there's some folks that are really close to me that are First Nations that they want the changes to happen tomorrow. We'd all like changes to happen tomorrow. I have to admit that, but I look at the it's a generational change for us as Canadians. And I use the example of my father. What he experienced in school was horrific. What I experienced in school was not great, but not horrific. But I know the generation that I was teaching in the 90s and 2000s, they saw a First Nations person in front of them. So there's
yeah,
a generational change.
that's right.
And you look at the educators today who I have so much respect for what they do and what's placed upon them in the classroom, that I know that there's First Nations children, Indigenous children across the country that now learn about our true history as Canadians, but also some local knowledge of where their school is. That's generational change. And that's where we have to continue to ask. Murray Sinclair, who was one of the main authors of the Truth and Reconciliation report, he talked about 7 generations. So we're only in the second or third generation
Yeah,
of making significant
yeah,
changes. We want to go faster.
yeah.
We have to be patient too.
Today's episode, we head back to British Columbia and hear the wise words of Brad Baker. Brad is a leader in British Columbia. He works at the ministry now, supporting Indigenous learning. And I've known Brad for a lot of years, not closely, but really have respected the way in which he has brought the Indigenous conversation to the table in a way that's very accessible for people and very inviting. And I keep coming back to that word, and especially after my conversation with Kevin Godden about Black history and anti-racism. I think that's always been a bit of a challenge for at least for us white folks out there. And that's on us to a degree. But at the same time, it is so powerful when you have somebody who brings you into the conversation and wants you, invites you to learn more and invites you to explore your own biases, your own perspectives that are probably not very good. And I fully admit my ignorance and my lack of understanding in this area. But Brad's somebody like I want to learn more and I want to better understand the ways in which we are moving forward. And he gives such a great overall perspective on the things that we are really doing well as a country. He talks specifically about British Columbia, but I see these trends across Canada, but also the things that we need to continue to improve on. And so lots of hope, lots of good things here. And Brad and I, again, connect as golfers, as you'll hear this coming up in the last few episodes. The other part of this that I think is so fascinating is British Columbia, once again, has such a great network of people and the intertwinings. You'll hear his shout out today to the person he's grateful for, who was a guest from a few weeks back. Lots of great leadership in the province of British Columbia, continuing to shine as a beacon of innovation and just thoughtfulness as education partners. Great conversation with Brad Baker. There's a lot here, so I would encourage you to listen to the whole thing. And I don't say this often enough, please subscribe. If you haven't already, please subscribe to one of the channels that you get these coming into each week. Here we go, Brad Baker. Okay, Brad, what is the state of your golf game right now? What's working really well for you? And what are you still saying, boy, I need more, this needs more attention?
Why I think my state of my golf game right now is we talk about reporting on learners across the K-12 system, always improving, room for improvement. And
Okay.
so I'm on the probably in the emergent category where I'm playing a lot of golf consistently, and probably the best part of my game is 100 yards in and on the putting green, but I can't really sort my driver out right now. So hope over the
Okay.
next 2 or 3 months, I'm able to sort my driver out.
That's what makes it interesting. There's always something you can work on, but you also gotta glad you point out the part that there's things that are going on. I'm proud of that. So that's how we hold up our head here. So, Brad, I know you're with the ministry now, but you didn't start your career with the ministry. So just give us a quick synopsis of your trajectory to where you are today.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I started off in the North Vancouver School District in the early 90s. I was actually the first member of the Squamish Nation where I'm a member of to get a teaching degree. And so there was a little bit of a competition to get me hired from the Sea to Sky School District in the North Vancouver School District. So I actually started off on a letter of permission. during my PDP program at Simon Fraser University, and they placed me in a kindergarten class for a couple of months, 6, 7 weeks, and it was, and I have a smile on my face because it was a long 6, 7 weeks. I give, primary grade teachers a lot of credit for what they do, and I guess I was fortunate enough, when I was on a letter of permission in the early '90s, kindergarten class was only 2.5 hours a day. It wasn't the full day kindergarten class they have down in British Columbia. And I think that then after my PDP was done, graduated from SFU, I'm a history teacher by trade, social studies teacher by trade, and I slipped into a position that was in back then called First Nations education, and I worked with the grade 8 and 9 learners, Indigenous learners that were going into a school called Carson Graham Secondary School in North Vancouver. And I look back on that time in my career, I was part of the system that was streamlining First Nations kids into segregated programs. And so my first 3 or 4 years of my career, we I was responsible for a program that was off-site from the main high school for the morning, and in the afternoon, the kids would walk up to the school with me for their elective classes. Then after that was all done, I moved into teaching English and social studies, even taught a foods class once at Carson Graham because they were short a teacher for foods. And I think part of my trajectory at Carson Graham allowed me to grow some leadership skills. I became a department head with special education. And then I dipped my toe into administration and became a acting vice principal at Carson Graham School, and then moved into a district role, a district administrator role, it was called back then, where I was responsible for safe schools. And so safe schools in the 2007, 2008 time was just starting to become the norm within the public system. And then halfway, 2 years after starting the Safe Schools Administration job, I also became the district administrator for Indigenous Ed. So I had two big portfolios, Safe Schools and Indigenous Education. So I did that for about a decade in North Vancouver, maybe 12 years or longer than that. And I just continued to improve my leadership skills to where I am today with the seconded to the ministry.
So a lot of stuff happened in there, and I love the kindergarten. So I taught first grade for first 7 years of my career, so I spent time there, and, I knew at some point, yeah, the patience that it takes to do this, and especially as my kids were getting older, it's a special thing, and, that'd have been quite a sight because 'cause you're a big guy, Brad, and so
I'm a big guy.
to
I'm a big
see
guy.
it's so nice to see you there was like kindergarten cop all over again. You were Arnold Schwarzenegger before he was Arnold
I
Schwarzenegger.
jokingly say to some folks when I speak about that experience, for those 2.5 hours, I had a lot of outside time, outside running around the fields a lot, and I even tried to incorporate nap time in the kindergarten like they had in daycare, but that didn't work very well. No, it was a great experience I had, to say the least.
And as you shared that, you talked about the various roles that began to identify the fact that you're an Indigenous man and you bring that perspective with it. But I want you to look back, and I look back at at the introduction to the fact that and really it hasn't been that long. I think people are always shocked when they hear about how far residential schools, like that's not ancient history, that's recent memory. And even here in Saskatchewan, and we have a large Indigenous population, but it feels like to me when I started teaching in 1988, like it was maybe even in the early 90s when we started to say, I think we have to pay attention to this. So it's relatively new. So when you look back and you're looking back when you're first as a teacher, you're just an Indigenous person at that point. You don't have any specific responsibilities to anybody else. But when you think about where we are now, where we were then, how would you describe that journey? Maybe the good things that you think, hey, we've come a long way, and maybe the things like, man, are we still doing this?
Yeah. I love these questions. I'll talk about, the personal perspective. First of all, my dad's a residential school survivor, and so that lives with me every day and lived with me at the very beginning of my teaching career. And I look at my early on in my career as a First Nations person that was in the public system. It wasn't really celebrated that I was a First Nations person that was a teacher, because none of our curriculum really represented me as an individual or the nation that I was from. And but I was well accepted as a staff member, as a community member. So I want to make sure I say that, where the Carson Graham community back then was very strong, I was involved with athletics, coaching multiple sports throughout the year, which allowed me to be part of the learning community, the vibrant learning community. When you look at the Indigenous education perspective, our collective history around the residential schools, the different policies of repression, we're all aware of that. But it really wasn't taught in the system. It definitely wasn't taught in the system when you and I were in high school. You look at my first 10 years of my teaching career from the early 90s to the early 2000s, very little was done around Indigenous education for all. I think when we talk about Indigenous education in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was particularly Indigenous education was only for Indigenous learners. There was the odd pockets in the province and across the country where it was for all learners, but I think a significant change happened probably in British Columbia in North Vancouver School District, probably just around 2008 or so when Prime Minister Harper apologized in the House for what happened in residential schools and the formal apology to Indigenous peoples. That kind of opened the eyes and the hearts of Canadians that, hey, this really happened in our backyard. It's like open the doors for curricular changes. And so you look at 2008, it's only 16 years ago. And so really fresh into this changes. And I recall when I was teaching at Carson Graham, the first attempt at Indigenous curriculum, the shared learnings document, that was a K to 12 document. It was very, it was well done as a first step. It was very superficial. And you look at that stepping stone to where the major stakeholders like BCTF, all the post secondaries, the ministry, school districts, they were trying to come together right around 2008 or so, just after that, say, hey, what can we do to improve Indigenous education in the province? And I think that's where British Columbia made a real strong effort to move away from a pan-Indigenous approach that all Indigenous people are the same, where we started talking more about BC First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit. We're all distinct people.
Right.
And I think that's one thing that probably the last 5 or 6 years, I've really noticed a big shift at the public school district level where significant changes are being made. Because I think part of Indigenous education now is not only to educate the educators in the system, because I know our first responsibility is the learners. We know that. But there's so many teachers in the system that were never taught Indigenous perspective or worldview. So there's so many multiple facets of learning that's going on.
I'm one of those people that raised my hand. I was never taught this. I'm claiming ignorance around I didn't understand even residential schools until
Right.
more recently, right? Which is
You know,
frightening when you think about I think about the way in which Americans are chastised about their understanding of their slavery, and as I mentioned in my interview with Kevin, sometimes we think we're better than them. Like we would never do that. And that was like, yeah, well, don't too high on yourself because we've done as many horrific things as any other culture. We're not immune from that. So
that's like when I was teaching social studies 10 and 11, I taught everything about the American Civil Rights Movement,
yeah,
taught about apartheid in South Africa, taught about the Holocaust. I taught about the Japanese Canadians during World War II in Steveston, part of British Columbia, being sent to internment camps. I never taught about my own history, the residential school history, right? So it's all relatively new
yeah.
in the system. I
It
think
hardly
one
felt
thing
like history at that time because it just
exactly,
happened, just
exactly.
ended. You don't, but yeah,
And I like your comment about just your own knowledge around residential schools. I really do think a landmark date here in British and for Canada was in May 2021 when the findings of the Kamloops Indian Residential School of some unmarked graves, that made a significant change in people's moral compass, I guess you could say, or them wanting to know more. And so I talked about those first two layers of an educator being educate the learners, but educate ourselves. We're now asking schools and school districts to educate the community, which means the parents.
right.
And because parents here are coming into schools that I'm aware of that are the kids are going home talking about residential schools or policies of oppression, and and the parents don't know how to talk to their kids about it because they were never taught about it. So there's those I call it the three pathways of Indigenous education. It's our learners, it's our educators, and our broader community, our parents. They're so important. They got to blend together.
So one of the things I think is interesting though, too, is again, in those early days, the early 90s, and you got to understand too, I'm coming from Saskatchewan, pretty
Mm,
white, way less. Things aren't the same now, but at that time, we did not have, we had a handful of immigrants, we had a handful of refugee kids, but they were extreme minorities. So indigenous learn when that conversation began to happen, that was wholly focused on understanding indigenous education to whatever degree. But today, when we think about what our schools look like all across Canada, they are multicultural as anything. There are kids from countries with all kinds of oppression racism is not just towards any one group, it happens to a lot of people. I guess my question is from your perspective at the ministry, what is your philosophy and approach to holding both of those things at the same time? That we in Canada have a unique culture and history that happened long before all of these
Mhm.
new Canadians have become here that impact where we are today. And yet at the same time, the conversation about inclusiveness and understand and cultural responsiveness and all those things now includes a lot more cultures. And I don't know
Mhm.
if that I'm
Yeah.
making sense with that
No, no,
question, but,
no.
like, how do you uphold what you're doing, saying this is important, but also this is important too?
I think the big thing for me is just the term equity. What does equity mean? I think there's some folks, I think a lot of folks need to realize when we talk about equity for all learners, that means we have to continue to uplift every learner, no matter
Yeah,
where they're from. And I think for the longest time, both of us started our careers many years ago. There was a beliefs in the system. This is my perspective when I was working in North Van, that Indigenous learners were not capable of succeeding in the public system.
right,
And so I think the narrative, when we talk about changing the narrative for Indigenous learners, we want to create equitable opportunities for them to be successful. And I think that's what we're doing. And that's not dismissing any other cultural belief system or
sure,
non-Indigenous people, because we're all trying to lift each other up. But I think when we talk about Indigenous learners specific, that equitable piece means that we are hoping that educators are now bringing the Indigenous worldview into their practice, their local Indigenous worldview. So if I'm working in North Vancouver, I want to make sure I bring in the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh perspective into my practices.
right,
That's not asking anyone to get rid of any other perspectives, but for so long, our system was built upon the exclusion of Indigenous peoples.
right.
And so I think when we talk about, I love Kevin's comment about uh, the levels of oppression or the hierarchy of oppression. There's really not a hierarchy of oppression. What we want to do is continue to work together to ensure that we're providing equal opportunities, which means equitable opportunities, right?
Right.
Because equality is different than equity.
Yep.
And I think there's some folks out there that get those mixed up. And I think where we are in British Columbia is that we're slowly moving through that equitable lens, which is awesome. And I think, but we're really early on the journey, right?
Yeah.
We have to remember, I think there's some folks that are really close to me that are First Nations that they want the changes to happen tomorrow. And I look at we'd all like changes to happen tomorrow. I have to admit that, but I look at it's a generational change for us as Canadians. And I use the example of my father, what he experienced in school was horrific. What I experienced in school was not great, but not horrific. But I know the generation that I was teaching in the 90s and 2000s, they saw a First Nations person in front of them. So there's
Yeah.
a generational change.
That's right.
And you look at the educators today who I have so much respect for what they do and what's placed upon them in the classroom, that I know that there's First Nations children, Indigenous children across the country that now learn about our true history as Canadians, but also some local knowledge of where their school is. That's generational change. And that's where we have to continue to ask. Murray Sinclair, who was one of the main authors of the Truth and Reconciliation report, he talked about 7 generations. So we're in the second or third generation
Yeah.
of making significant
Yeah.
changes. We want to go faster.
Yeah.
We have to be patient too.
Can you give me maybe a couple of examples of practices and structures that you think this is really good? Like people should know about how these folks are handling it. And so just curious, you have a hand on, you have a pulse on what's happening across British Columbia. Can you give me a couple of examples of exemplary work?
Yeah, man. I look at there's a school district in the Fraser Valley. Can I name it? Chilliwack. I'll name it Chilliwack.
Do
Who's
it.
doing some great work because they're very conscious around what consultation, collaboration, and co-development is with the local rights holders. And I think when with the leadership team out there ensuring that the First Nations rights holders whose land the school district resides on are part of the ongoing communication and development of strategies, planning, the whole nine, that is significant progress from where we were 10 years ago. And it's a medium-sized school district, but I also look at Vancouver school districts here in the Lower Mainland where they have the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam, whose land they're on. So very strong political nations a very small on reserve population in that district. But the leadership team over there has done tremendous to ensure that they're following the local protocols when they talk about how meetings are moved forward. So no longer are school districts, this is the same across the province as it probably is across Canada. School districts are no longer make having all their meetings at the in the school board office. We now encourage senior leadership teams to go into the community to meet with First Nations leaders and knowledge keepers. And that's a huge shift because for a while there, 20 years ago, people wouldn't dare step foot on their reserve to meet with people, but now that's part of the ongoing processes. And I think one thing I'm really proud of in British Columbia is the relationship with the First Nations Education Steering Committee, which helped develop the mandatory Indigenous focused grad requirement now in BC. This is the first year every learner will have a course focused on Indigenous education at graduate, which is awesome.
If you could, you got a magic wand, you could just speed things up just a little bit. What's one thing that you'd say if we could implement this consistently tomorrow in our schools in some capacity, maybe it's something you've already touched on, or maybe it's something else that would just accelerate things a little bit faster. What would you do?
I think it would be changing the help and support the change in mindset of our leaders across the province where we have the diagram know, do, and understand in our curriculum phases
Yep.
here in British Columbia. I would change that to an Indigenous focus where we want to understand the First Nations people we work with, validate the rights holders of them, which means we value them, which means we create authentic relationships. If I had a magic wand, it would be the ongoing creation of authentic relationships.
This episode is brought to you by Advanced Learning Partnerships, also known as ALP. We are a professional learning consulting group that serves communities across North America. We are partners, designers, and agents for change. You can learn more about the work we do at alplearn.com. And now back to the show. Excellent. All right. I want to shift a little bit more to you specifically as a leader and growing up. So I asked this question to a couple people, but all right, you got to make a highlight reel of the Brad Baker educational journey. So this is, I don't know, we'll say you're not retiring, but let's say you're retiring and they're going to show this video of the three most important moments in your career. What would they be, Kenyan?
Wow, that's a great question. It's a great thing to think of. I think I would talk about my leadership career. I'd go back to my high school days
Yeah.
as a start. Like I said, my experience in K to 7 was quite negative, and so I try to block that out of my mind. But my high school career, there was one teacher who created a real strong sense of belonging in me for the system, which was was grade 9. My grade 9 English teacher, her name was Kathleen Barter. I remember like it was yesterday, my grade 9 English class. But she built the strength in me to be a strong individual, which allowed me to carry myself in the Western system, but also still uphold my Squamish belief system. And that allowed that collaboration between my own thought processes to be successful. And then that's my first milestone. My second milestone, if there was a highlight reel, would most likely be around 2010 or 11, where when I was a district principal in North Vancouver, and it was the first time that a First Nations person at a principal's and vice principal meeting had made a presentation on the local history of the school district, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh. And that was significant for me, very nerve-wracking because very vulnerable about my own experiences in the system, but I also brought in local knowledge of the importance of the reserves within our school district, the life off the water, out of the woods, etc. And that was significant because that allowed my colleagues, other principals and vice principals, to actually respect who I was. That I wasn't placed in my role as a district principal because I was First Nations. I actually earned that right to be there.
Yeah.
I was able to explain my story. And probably another significant highlight reel would probably be when I got seconded to the Ministry of Education. And then one of my first meetings uh, in my role was when I was lucky enough. I'm going to talk about two things with this role. The first one was I was called in to meet with the minister with the First Nation school district about language. the development of the ongoing language, revitalization, financial components. And the minister turned around and asked me, Brad, what's your opinion on this? So I'm sitting in the colonial building of the house in Victoria, and someone's asking my opinion as a Squamish First Nation. I go, actually, so I walked at me and go, holy smokes, I can't believe that just happened. I look back to my own, I would have been 51 then. And I look back 46 years ago, I was in kindergarten. Who would have thought that I'd be sitting here, somebody asking me my opinion? That was a very humbling experience. And then probably about a month later, one of my first trips, I went to community of Hazelton and get off the plane at Terrace, drive to Hazelton. Um, and I remember walking to the school, we get over a car, and there's kindergarten, grade one students there from the Gitxsan people, and they sang us an honor song. And I look back to 5 and 6 year olds who were celebrating their culture, using the language to the best of their ability, and drumming really hard and screaming really loud. And I reflected that night when I got back to my hotel is, okay, that was me. If so, 46, 47 years ago, I was not allowed to do that in my school. And now we have these young kids up in Hazelton doing their practicing their culture. That made me proud to be a First Nations person, but also reminded me of my responsibility of a leader to ensure that never goes away again.
That's
There's a
powerful, Brad. Yeah, thinking
yeah,
about actually all three of those little pieces, if you will, reflects back on 5 or 6-year-old Brad and what it was like to be and feel
yeah,
as an Indigenous person. And that story about having a minister at being in that space, in that colonial space, and wasn't lost on you, but just the trajectory of what had happened is pretty powerful. So important
yeah.
to connect that.
Every once in a while, like after that story, and my mother and father are still with us, still alive, and they're immense advocates for me and my siblings in the public system. And every once in a while, I make sure to tell them stories like I've shared with you, and they don't know what to say sometimes
Yeah.
because they struggled so hard for us to have an equitable education.
Yeah.
And now they're seeing the fruits of it. I got 7 or 8 nephews and nieces and nephews who have gone through the system, and they've all had a different experience. But I look back to the struggles my mom and dad had. They fought for us, and
Yeah.
so that's ingrained on me to continue their good fight for all the Indigenous kids in the province and the country. That's a responsibility that's been placed on my shoulders for sure.
That's powerful. And and as a leader in your journey, there's always challenges. And I think one of the things that I try to do through this podcast is help people unpack the process of handling those challenges because it's inherent to the job and it's just you face them all the time. So I don't know if you can give us one challenge that you face, especially ones where yeah, it wasn't looking very good for a while. Like it was an uncomfortable, awkward, not great situation that you figured out. Like I got through it and maybe you didn't do it, whatever, but you reflect on it and say, like, that was a really learning moment for you as a leader.
Yeah, I think one thing that I always the last 2, 5 years, probably more than anything, I always remind myself when things aren't going well or difficult situations that I'm also a human. I'm a human being like everybody else. Sometimes we got to remind ourselves of that. Probably the biggest struggles I've endured recently is you mentioned earlier about racism. There's still high levels of racism out there towards Indigenous peoples. And I think I'm very fortunate when I was in North Vancouver in the role now, I get to provide some knowledge across our province, across our country. And there's always times where folks come up to me and after a presentation or a keynote or whatever going, I don't believe anything you're saying. I don't believe that your dad went to residence school. I don't believe this. I don't believe we should be teaching about Indigenous rights because, it's not your land anymore. Little things like that. But more
Yeah.
recently, one of the struggles was I was in the school district just about a week ago, and I was fortunate enough to tell the creation story of my nation, where our people came from. We come from the waters near Chuckwell, near Gibsons, BC, and then my ancestors, then my family, a couple hundred years ago moved to a reserve called Squamish. So I explained that story to them, have some photos from in early 1900s of my family. Then after the keynote, a gentleman came up to me and said, your creation story is all wrong because all you Canadian natives came from Asia. And so my reaction maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I would have gone, "Yeah, you know what? But like I said to this person, I respect your opinion, as I respect where your creation story comes from. All I do is want you to respect where mine comes from. And I think that's one thing that I've learned through empathy and compassion is that everyone's on their own journey of understanding who we are as human beings. But that so professionally, that I take that very serious, not to ensure that I treat people equitable, but it's still hurtful. And so I think that escape system,
Yeah.
the backup system I have. We started the conversation about golf. I've got some great non-Indigenous friends who really are strong allies of myself and my family. So I continually reach out to them for supports, for my own mental well-being and cultural well-being. And so, yeah, I think that's. But if I get irate or get mad at an individual, all I'm going to do is continue the cycles of violence towards people, and I want to stop that.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it, and I think that's it's all comes down to like how do we see each other as humans, right? How do we get to that point? And I think there's also, and I'd be guilty of this too. Like the one thing that Kevin shared again, and I know that's part of the Indigenous story too, is this idea of let's just all be good to each other, nice to each other. That's good,
Yeah,
but if you don't acknowledge there's some systemic pieces here that listen, I don't have to feel personally guilty for, but I need to acknowledge that they exist for people. And that's your story. And this is why to me having time to talk to you and just getting a little bit more and more about what was that like? How does that differ from my experience? And how can I understand and figure that out is so powerful. And it's people like you who invite me in to the
yeah,
conversation. It's an invitation, like, you gotta invite people in, and how you create that invitation might look differently. So, the next question I have, and you can follow up to that, but I also wanna think about I think part of what you hope to do, I'm sure, is to grow more Indigenous leaders in the community to continue on this work. So, specifically speaking to a young whether they're a teacher, but primarily in education, some of our young Indigenous educators, what would you say to them about just advice about like how they can continue to grow their leadership abilities and impact?
yeah. I think that the probably the biggest thing for me, I go back to when I told my own story, my own highlight reel. I mean, it was 18 years in my career, probably longer than that. It wasn't until then I actually created a circle of people around me that I could trust. And I think that's one thing I would say to a younger Indigenous teacher: make sure that you're creating a sphere of influence of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people that you can learn from to allow you to grow yourself in multiple ways, obviously professionally, but also personally. Because I think that personal aspect for Indigenous people, we can't separate personal and professional lives because of we talked about the racism earlier and all that. And I think if you're able to have a strong base of knowledge of who you are, know your own story, I would encourage every Indigenous younger leader, know your own story first and foremost, and then invite folks into your circle so you can know who they are. And that's called, building positive relationships. Um, and don't do, I would encourage them not to do what I did when I first started to teach, where I want to say maybe is hid the right word. I was shy about who I was to my colleagues as a First
Right.
Nations person because I didn't want to be judged less than others. And I think the way we are in our province and across the country now, sure, there are still pockets of people that don't think Indigenous people are worthy. But I think the more the system opens up to have an open heart and open mind, I would encourage the younger folks, Indigenous folks, to celebrate who they are. Because if they're able to build, I talk about the strong base, but the emotional base, the heart, when we talk about heart, I talk about love. If they love themselves and who they are, it's going to make them better leader. And I
Yeah.
wish I did that earlier in my career, but that's one advice I'd give them for sure.
And it ties into this idea of building a sphere of influence. Because if I'm going to show who I am, I'm going to know that who the haters are and who are the people that they're accepting me for who I am, and I can grow with them. So it probably gets you to that sphere of influence more quickly than if you're trying to be somebody that you're not or whatever.
Exactly.
You already named your high school English teacher, but I want you to give me one
Yes.
more person specifically that you are grateful for in education. And I like it to be somebody that might listen to this, hear their name, and go, "Oh, thanks, Brad, for doing that." But again, I know there's a lots of people, but pick one.
Probably the one person in education who's had a big influence on me is the superintendent of Surrey schools right now, Mark Permain. Mark and I are the same age. I grew up on the reserve. He grew up in West Vancouver, one of the wealthy areas in West Van. We crossed paths as teenagers playing sports against each other. but we never talked to each other. And then when he became assistant superintendent in North Van, he was my supervisor, and we got to get to know each other, got to know each other's soul, if I want to say that word. We were both very spiritual people. I've obviously my spiritual belief system is with my nation. His spiritual belief is through the Western spiritual world. But we got to know each other, and he challenged me to be better, to be stronger as a First Nations person. He also called me out on my stuff that I needed to change in my personal life or professional life, and allowed me to build structures um, to lead upon. But I also still respect him, but I respect him when he was superintendent in North Van, where he had an open door policy with me where I could come into his office and fully disagree with him on comments that he might have made at a leadership meeting or whatever. Also, he allowed me to show my emotions in front of him, and I openly cried in front of him over issues that were going on in my personal or professional life. And they also allowed me to sit at extended executive table where my voice could be heard with all the other leaders in the district. And to this day, we've obviously gone our separate ways the last 2.5 years, but we still make a point of connecting once every 2 months for breakfast to check in. And the first question we ask each other, how are you doing? I think that one question, if I go back to my indigenous leaders, I would ask them, how are you doing? Because sometimes we get too far we get too into business too fast. But Mark allows the social, emotional, personal development to happen first before we talk about professional.
I'm smiling, Brad, because, well, a couple things. First, when you just at the end there where you talked about asking that question, how are you doing? So I had, little known fact, a brief tenure, maybe a year as our lead Indigenous consultant here at my school district, which I had no business doing, but that tells you where it was in the priority of at that time. But anyway, I remember going to meetings at the ministry where the meeting was supposed to begin at 10 o'clock and you showed up at 10 o'clock. And for the first half hour, they just wanted to know about your family and how, and I'm looking at my watch going, shouldn't we
Yeah.
be starting on the agenda? And they made it clear that says, like, they, at some point, they realized there were a few of us new ones in there, said, oh, just so you know, we intentionally do it this way because we're not spending the day together unless I have some sense of who you are and how you're doing and all that stuff, which I found to be like so different from anything I had experienced and thought, isn't that a lovely way to do this work? And so that's my long-standing memory from that tenure. But the other reason I'm smiling is because 2 hours ago, I did a podcast with Mark.
Wow.
Yeah, and had dinner with him earlier in the week, and I knew of Mark a little bit, but didn't know him as well as I've had a chance to spend a few hours with him, and I think you very lovely
Yeah.
built on when I began to see him as a leader, so that's great, and he will hear
Yeah.
that, and I think that's
Good,
just
good.
fantastic. All right, let's wrap up with a couple of a little bit more rapid fire questions. What are you reading or listening to? If you're I don't know if you're a podcast listener or reader,
Yeah, I'm
what do
reading
you
right
consume?
now, Valley of the Birdtail is one of my books right now I'm reading, but I'm reading a book called The Stories from Quetzalano, which is a history of Vancouver, co-written by a Squamish person 100 years ago. And
Nice.
so those are the two things. So I'm continuing to learn about who I am myself. So that's a big
Yeah.
thing. I also want to learn about other Indigenous peoples across Canada. That's why Valley of the Birdtail.
Excellent. Okay, we'll put those out for folks. When you're not trying to learn and be smart, what do you watch just to get away from it all? A little bit of mindless
Wow.
viewing.
Below Deck. I watch all the Below Deck shows on Slice, Below Deck, Mediterranean. Yeah, that's my guilty pleasure right now is
Yeah,
watching
you
Below
gotta
Deck.
have one. I love this.
Yeah.
I love it when I ask this people because people do get vulnerable and say whether it's, "Oh, I watch Hallmark movies." They're a little bit embarrassed, but reality TV is my escape. And you know what? This is a hard job. You got to have that too. So, do you live in North Van? Is that where you live?
Yes. Yeah, North Van.
So here's my question. It doesn't have to pertain to North Van, uh, but it could be anything. So I've never been to Vancouver before. I'm going to come for the very first time. I can do the searches and find the top 5 things to do in the area. but I want you to give me like a hidden gem. Like this might not be the first thing, but a place you should go, a thing you should do, something to experience that is a little bit lesser known, a hidden gem, if you will. Would you recommend?
The one hidden gem I think is so awesome is a company called Takaya Tours. It's a canoe trip up Indian Arm that's run by the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and the knowledge keepers that they have on board with you on the canoe, it's a 3 or 4 hour gig they do with you, where you get to hear them on the land tell their stories of the land, and then you go on the water, hear the stories of the water. And that's when we talk about, I started the conversation today about talking about grounding ourselves and where we are. And Takaya Tours is brilliant, and it's well known, but not well known. I know a lot of schools use it, but I don't know if a lot of the general public use it.
That's fantastic. I'm glad I didn't want to force you into an Indigenous kind of recommendation, but I think it fits well with our conversation. Listen, Brad, this was all I'd hoped for and more. I hope it was a great conversation to you. I learned a lot, and I'm excited to share this with everyone in Canada and beyond. So thank you for the work you're doing and this time.
Thank you for the time. Great opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.